At my stepdaughter's engagement party, she grabbed a glass of red wine off a passing tray and threw it directly at my chest in front of 200 guests, screaming that I was nothing but hired help who didn't belong at a family celebration. My husband stood 3 feet away and said nothing. I wiped the wine from my dress, smiled politely, and walked toward the coat check. That is when the wedding planner froze mid-sentence, turned pale, and said the 4 words that changed everything in that ballroom forever. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you have ever been made to feel small by people who owe you everything, hit that like button and subscribe, because tonight, I finally stopped shrinking. My name is Elena Cross. I am 34 years old. For the past 6 years, I have quietly built and operated one of the most respected boutique hospitality companies on the East Coast, a company that owns and manages 11 event venues for historic hotels and a catering division that services some of the most exclusive weddings, galas, and corporate functions in the region. Almost nobody I socialize with outside of my executive team knows this. To my husband's family, I am simply Elena, the interior consultant. That is the story I let them believe. Because 4 years ago, when I fell in love with Daniel Whitfield, I made a decision that I now understand was the single greatest miscalculation of my adult life. I decided not to tell him who I really was. I did not lie out of shame. I hid my identity because I had watched for years what happened to women in my position. I had watched business partners' wives get quietly resented by their own families the moment real money entered a marriage. I had watched friends of mine get reduced to their net worth, their family's opinion of them shifting overnight from, "She seems lovely," to, "She must be marrying him for something." I wanted, for once in my adult life, to be loved for exactly who I was without a single dollar attached to the equation. I wanted a man to choose me, not my balance sheet. So when I met Daniel at a mutual friend's dinner party, and he asked what I did for a living, I told him I consulted on interior design and event staging for hospitality clients. It was not technically a lie. It was simply an incomplete truth, one I told myself I would eventually correct once the relationship had solidified into something unshakable. Daniel is 44 years old, an architect at a respected but mid-sized firm downtown, kind in the ordinary moments, quiet, a little guarded, a man who grew up with a father who left when he was 9 and a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep him and his sister fed. I understood him. I respected the quiet dignity with which he had built his career. What I did not fully understand, not until it was far too late, was the wound that his first marriage had left behind, and the daughter that wound had shaped. Peyton is 24. She is Daniel's only child from his first marriage to a woman named Renata, a marriage that ended when Peyton was 6, in a divorce so bitter that Daniel still will not discuss the details with me even now. Peyton grew up split between 2 households, worshipped by her mother, who told her constantly that her father had abandoned them for someone younger and more exciting, even though Daniel did not remarry until Peyton was 19 years old, and even though I am, in fact, 10 years older than the story Renata told her daughter would suggest. By the time I entered Peyton's life, she had already spent 18 years being told, in ways subtle and unsubtle, that any woman her father loved was an intruder, a threat, a placeholder standing in the space that rightfully belonged to her mother. I tried in the beginning. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I did not walk into this marriage expecting to be resented. I showed up at Peyton's college graduation with flowers and a card, and a check I never mentioned came from an account with considerably more zeros in it than my consulting salary would suggest. I sat through birthday dinners where she spoke to her father as though I were not in the room. I absorbed, for 4 years, a low, persistent hum of disrespect, telling myself that time would soften her, that consistency would eventually earn me a place at the table. I told myself this the way people tell themselves things they need to believe in order to keep showing up. Tonight was supposed to be a happy night. 6 months ago, Peyton got engaged to a young man named Tyler Sterling, the son of a real estate developer named Grant Sterling, a man whose name appears on half the luxury condominium towers that have gone up along the waterfront in the last decade. The Sterling family is, by every outward measure, wealthy in the loud, performative way that certain families are wealthy. The kind of wealth that needs an audience, that requires validation, that cannot simply exist quietly in a bank account but must be worn, driven, and displayed. Peyton had been dating Tyler for 18 months, and from the moment the engagement was announced, I watched something in her shift. She began speaking about her future in-laws with a kind of reverence she had never once extended to me. She began referencing real families and families with actual history in ways that were not subtle at all. The engagement party was held at a venue called the Aurelia, a converted 19th century glass conservatory downtown, all soaring iron and glass ceilings, a space that hosts perhaps 40 events a year, because the waiting list is measured in years, not months. Peyton had been thrilled when she secured the booking. She had told everyone who would listen that it had taken almost a year of persistence and no small amount of money to get on the Aurelia's calendar. What Peyton did not know, what almost nobody at that party knew, was that the Aurelia is owned, in its entirety, by Cross Hospitality Group. My company. My venue. My glass ceiling under which 200 guests would gather that night to celebrate her engagement and to humiliate me. I had known for weeks that the party would be difficult. Daniel had mentioned, almost apologetically, that Peyton wanted the event to feel like her mother's side of the family, which was Peyton's way of telling me, without telling me, that Renata would be attending, along with Renata's new husband, a hedge fund manager named Corbin, and that I should not expect much acknowledgement. I had agreed to attend anyway, because Daniel asked me to, because some quiet, stubborn part of me still believed that showing up again and again was its own form of dignity. I wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, understated jewelry, my hair pulled back. I did not wear anything that would announce who I was. I never did. The Aurelia was breathtaking that night, lit with hundreds of small hanging lanterns, tables draped in pale gold linen, an 8-piece orchestra playing near the fountain at the center of the room. I walked through the entrance and felt the particular, complicated pride of an owner watching her own creation succeed without anyone knowing she was the one who built it. I greeted the venue's general manager, a sharp, elegant woman named Priya Anand, with a small, private nod, the kind of acknowledgement we always exchanged when I attended events at my own properties incognito. Priya has worked for Cross Hospitality for 4 years. She has personally overseen more than 300 events in this building. She has also, on more than one occasion, quietly steered a difficult client away from a public meltdown with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a firm hand on an elbow. I did not know, walking through those doors, how badly I would need her tonight. Daniel found me near the champagne tower, kissed my cheek, told me I looked beautiful, and then was quickly pulled away by Grant Sterling, who wanted to introduce him to a city councilman standing near the fountain. I did not mind. I have spent 4 years learning to occupy the edges of rooms in this family, sipping sparkling water, watching, waiting for the evening to be over so I could go home and simply exist as myself again. I found a quiet corner near the orchestra and watched the party swirl around me, Renata in a deep emerald gown, holding court near the bar with a cluster of women I did not recognize. Grant Sterling's wife, a woman named Camille, dripping in what I recognized, from years of appraising jewelry for insurance purposes on behalf of clients, as an easily $200,000 diamond collar, and Peyton radiant, laughing, moving through the crowd like a woman who had never once doubted her place in the world. The toasts began around 9 o'clock. Grant Sterling went first, a booming self-satisfied speech about legacy and family and the merging of 2 great houses, language so absurdly theatrical that I nearly laughed into my water glass. Renata went next, tearful, performative, thanking everyone who truly showed up for Peyton over the years, a phrase so pointed that several guests near me actually turned to glance in my direction. And then Peyton took the microphone. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have replayed it in my mind so many times since that night that I could recite it like scripture. Peyton stood at the small raised platform near the orchestra, champagne flute in hand, and thanked her mother, her father, Tyler, the Sterling family, her bridesmaids, and a college roommate who had flown in from Chicago. She did not mention me. This, in itself, I had braced for. I had attended enough of these events to know that my name would likely not be spoken aloud. What I had not braced for was what came after. I want to say something real tonight, Peyton continued, her voice carrying easily through the glass-domed room, the orchestra having gone silent. 200 faces turned toward her. Tonight is about family. Real family. The kind of family that shows up for you your whole life, not the kind that just shows up when it's convenient or when there's a party to attend. A small ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the crowd. I felt my stomach tighten. I did not yet understand where this was going, but some old, tired part of me already knew. I've had a lot of people come in and out of my life claiming to want to be part of this family, she went on, her eyes finding mine across the room with a precision that told me this had not been spontaneous. People who show up to the events, who smile in the photos, who let everyone assume they belong here. But belonging isn't about showing up to the party. It's about actually being family. She raised her glass slightly, still looking directly at me. So tonight, I just want to make something very clear to everyone here, especially to Tyler's family, who are about to become my real family. Some people in this room are guests, and some people are just the help who happened to get invited. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 full seconds, which is an eternity in a room of 200 people. Then, somewhere near the bar, a woman laughed, sharp and surprised, and the laughter spread the way laughter does when people are unsure whether something cruel is meant to be funny but decide, collectively, to treat it that way rather than sit with the discomfort. I stood perfectly still near the orchestra, my water glass in my hand, feeling 200 pairs of eyes shift toward me in the particular, cruel way that a crowd turns when it has been given permission to look. I looked for Daniel. I want to be honest and say that in that moment, some small, foolish, hopeful part of me still expected him to do something. To cross the room. To take the microphone from his daughter's hand and correct her, gently, firmly, the way a father should when his child has just publicly humiliated his wife in front of 200 people. Instead, Daniel stood near Grant Sterling, his jaw tight, his eyes on the floor, saying nothing at all. He did not defend me. He did not even look at me. In 4 years of marriage, I had absorbed 100 smaller insults from this family and told myself, each time, that Daniel's silence was simply conflict avoidance, a man raised by a single mother who had learned early that peace was safer than confrontation. Standing there under the glass dome of my own building, watching my husband stare at the floor while his daughter called me the help in front of 200 people, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that his silence was not passivity. It was a choice. It had always been a choice. I set my water glass down on a nearby table with a hand that did not shake, and I began to walk toward the exit, because I did not intend to give Peyton the satisfaction of watching me cry in front of her fiancé's family. I made it perhaps 10 steps before Peyton's voice cut through the room again, sharper now, emboldened by the laughter she had already received. "Oh, don't leave, Elena," she called out. And I turned to see her walking toward me, still holding her champagne flute, her face flushed with something that was not entirely alcohol. "Actually, since you're clearly not going to say anything for yourself, let me help everyone understand exactly who you are. My dad's wife here doesn't have a real job. She tells people she's some kind of interior design consultant, but nobody's ever actually seen her work on anything. She just shows up to parties, wearing dresses my dad pays for, pretending she belongs somewhere she clearly doesn't." I did not respond. I have spent my entire professional life learning the particular discipline of silence in rooms where speaking would only escalate a situation that time and truth would eventually correct on their own. But Peyton, apparently unsatisfied by my silence, closed the remaining distance between us in 3 quick, unsteady steps, and in a motion so sudden that I did not have time to react, threw the contents of her champagne flute directly into my face. It was not, I would later realize, even champagne. Somewhere in the last 20 minutes, someone had refilled her glass with red wine, and it hit my cheek, my collarbone, the front of my ivory dress, spreading across the pale fabric in a dark, spreading stain that felt, in that moment, almost like blood. A few guests gasped. Someone near the bar actually laughed again, that same nervous, uncertain sound. I stood there, wine dripping from my chin onto the marble floor of my own building, and I felt something inside me go very, very quiet and very, very still. I did not scream. I did not cry. I reached up slowly and wiped a line of wine from my jaw with the back of my hand. I looked at Peyton, who was breathing hard, her chest heaving with the particular high of a person who has just done something they will later be unable to fully explain even to themselves. I looked past her at Daniel, who had finally moved, but only far enough to place a hand on Peyton's shoulder, murmuring something to her that I could not hear but could easily guess, something soothing, something that was almost certainly not a defense of me. I looked at Renata, who was smiling, actually smiling, with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a proxy war she had spent years quietly funding finally come to its intended conclusion. And I looked briefly at the 200 guests around me, at Grant Sterling's stunned expression, at Camille Sterling's hand pressed to her mouth in performative shock, at the orchestra members who had stopped playing entirely and were now simply watching, instruments lowered, waiting to see what would happen next. I turned, and I began walking toward the coat check at the far end of the room, my heels clicking against the marble in a steady, unhurried rhythm that I did not consciously choose, but that some deep, old part of me understood was the only dignity available to me in that moment. Wine dripped from the hem of my dress. I did not wipe my eyes, because there was nothing in them to wipe. I felt, strangely, almost nothing at all, the way I imagine a person feels in the exact moment before a bone breaks, when the body has not yet caught up to what has already happened. I was perhaps 15 feet from the coat check when Priya Anand appeared at my side, moving quickly, her face pale, her professional composure cracking in a way I had genuinely never seen in 4 years of working with her. She reached out and touched my arm, gently, and in a voice that was not loud, but that carried. In the sudden hush that had fallen over the room as guests strained to see what was happening, she said the 4 words that would end this evening the way it deserved to end. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" I want to explain why those 4 words landed the way they did, why a simple, professional expression of concern from an employee detonated across that ballroom like a small bomb. Priya Anand does not call anyone ma'am casually. It is a term she reserves, deliberately, formally, for exactly one person in her professional life, me, in my capacity as the owner of Cross Hospitality Group, whenever we are in a public setting where my identity must remain private but where she needs, for operational reasons, to signal deference. I had trained her to use that word years ago, precisely for situations like this one, situations where something had gone wrong at one of my properties and I needed staff to acknowledge my authority without announcing it to a room full of strangers. Priya had never had occasion to use it at a family event before. She used it now because she had just watched a guest assault another guest with a glass of wine in her venue, and every professional instinct she had told her that the woman standing in front of her, dripping wine onto marble floors, was not merely Daniel Whitfield's embarrassed wife. She was the owner of the building they were standing in. The room did not go silent immediately. It took a moment, the way it always does, for information to ripple outward from its point of origin. But I watched it happen in real time, watched the confusion spread across nearby faces as guests registered the strange formality of Priya's address, watched people turn to whisper to each other, watched Grant Sterling's expression shift from stunned amusement to something more calculating, more careful. And I watched Peyton's face, still flushed, still triumphant, begin slowly to falter, as she registered that something had just happened that she did not understand and that everyone around her seemed to understand better than she did. I turned to Priya. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because the room had already gone quiet enough that a normal speaking voice carried easily across the marble and glass. "I'm fine, Priya," I said. "But I'd like the general contract file for tonight's event pulled and sent to my office first thing tomorrow morning. I want to review the security protocols. I don't think we should be serving unlimited champagne to guests who clearly can't handle a glass of wine without assaulting other people with it." Priya nodded, professional again, her composure fully restored now that she understood the situation had shifted decisively in my favor. "Of course, Miss Cross," she said. "I'll have it ready for you. Miss Cross. Not Elena. Not Mrs. Whitfield. Miss Cross, the name on the deed to the building we were standing in, the name on the payroll of every single member of the staff moving quietly through that room, the name on the contract that had allowed this party to exist at all." The whispers that had begun as a low ripple now became something closer to a wave. I heard fragments of it as I stood there, wine still drying on my dress. "Cross Hospitality," someone murmured. "Wait, she owns this place? I thought she was just some interior designer. Oh my God." I did not move to correct any of it, and I did not move to confirm it either. I simply stood there, calm still, letting the truth do the work that 4 years of my own silence had failed to do. Grant Sterling was the first of the family to fully understand what had just happened, and I watched the exact moment it landed on him, because Grant Sterling is a real estate developer, and real estate developers know exactly who owns which buildings in this city, particularly the ones that generate this level of prestige and revenue. I watched him pull out his phone, unlock it with shaking hands, and type something into a search bar. I watched his face go pale as the results loaded. Cross Hospitality Group. Founder and CEO Elena Cross. 11 venues. 4 historic hotels. A catering division with contracts across 3 states. A woman he had spent the last 20 minutes assuming was some sort of glorified party planner's assistant, standing in the middle of his son's engagement party with red wine dripping down the front of an ivory dress that his own future daughter-in-law had ruined in front of 200 witnesses, in a building that belonged entirely and exclusively to her. Elena, Daniel said, finally crossing the room toward me, his voice tight with something between confusion and panic. What is she talking about? What does she mean, Miss Cross? I looked at my husband, at the man I had shared a bed with for 4 years, who had just stood silently while his daughter threw wine in my face and called me the help in front of everyone he knew, and who was now asking me to explain myself, as though the burden of clarity had ever, at any point in this marriage, belonged to me. I own this building, Daniel, I said quietly, evenly. I own Cross Hospitality Group. I've owned it for 6 years. This entire venue, the orchestra you hired, the staff serving your family drinks tonight, all of it belongs to me. I paused, letting the words settle over the small crowd that had begun to gather around us, guests drifting closer now, unable to resist the gravitational pull of a scandal unfolding in real time. I never told you because I wanted, for once in my life, to be loved for who I actually am, not for what I could provide. I see now that I made a terrible mistake. Not in hiding it. In marrying into a family that was always going to treat me as less, no matter what the truth turned out to be. Peyton, who had been standing frozen near the platform since Priya's initial interruption, finally found her voice, though it came out considerably smaller than it had 20 minutes earlier. You're lying, she said. You're just saying that because you're embarrassed. There's no way you own this place. You're a nobody. You're Peyton, Grant Sterling interrupted, his voice low and urgent, his phone still in his hand. Stop talking. Right now. I did not stay to watch what happened next. I had, by that point, said everything I needed to say, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having spent 6 years running a company that requires exactly this kind of composure in a crisis, that nothing productive would come from remaining in that room a moment longer. I walked to the coat check, retrieved my own coat from the small private closet Priya kept for me near the staff entrance, and left through the same service corridor I had used, on quieter nights, to walk through my own venue unnoticed. The night air outside the Aurelia was cold and clean, and I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, wine drying stiff against my collarbone, and I let myself, finally, feel something. Not tears. Something colder than tears. Something that felt, more than anything, like the final closing of a door I had spent 4 years refusing to admit was already shut. I did not go home that night. I want to be honest about the decision that followed, because it was not born of vengeance. Not yet. It was born, first, of simple exhaustion and a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever waited for me at the house Daniel and I shared would not be a comfort. I got into the back of a car I called through an app, gave the driver an address that was not my home, and rode in silence through the city, watching the lights blur past the window, thinking not about revenge but about my father. I have not spoken much in the course of my adult life about my father, because the empire I quietly run today was not built by me alone. It was built, first, by a man named Walter Cross, who started with a single failing catering hall in the early 90s and turned it, through 4 decades of ruthless, patient discipline, into one of the most respected hospitality portfolios on the East Coast. I am his only child. My mother died when I was 19, and in the years since, my father and I have built something that is equal parts business partnership and complicated, deeply loving relationship, the kind that exists between 2 people who understand each other's ambition because they share the exact same hunger. 6 years ago, my father formally handed the CEO title to me and stepped back into a chairman role, though anyone who knows him understands that Walter Cross has never truly stepped back from anything in his life. He simply prefers, these days, to operate from behind the curtain, watching, advising, occasionally intervening with the kind of surgical precision that 4 decades of experience affords a man. I had not told my father about Peyton's toast, about the wine, about any of it, by the time the car pulled up outside his building. I did not need to. My father took one look at me standing in his doorway, wine stained down the front of my ruined dress, and simply stepped aside to let me in, closing the door behind us before he asked a single question. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." I told him everything. I told him about 4 years of small, accumulating slights I had absorbed and rationalized and explained away. I told him about tonight, about Peyton's toast, about the wine, about Daniel's silence, about the particular, cutting cruelty of being called the help in a building I owned outright, by a girl whose engagement party existed at all because I had personally approved the booking 6 months earlier. Back when I still believed that showing up quietly and consistently might one day earn me a place in that family that no amount of truth-telling ever seemed capable of securing. My father listened without interrupting, the way he always has, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap in the particular stillness that I have learned, over the years, to recognize as the calm that precedes his most decisive moves. "You should have told me sooner," he said finally. "Not about tonight. About all of it. For years of this. I wanted to handle it myself," I said. "I wanted, just once, to be loved without the company attached." My father shook his head slowly. "Elena, you built something extraordinary. You did not build it so that you could hide from it in your own marriage. You built it so that no one ever could make you feel small again. And tonight, a 24-year-old girl threw a glass of wine in your face inside a building you own, and your husband stood there and let it happen." He leaned forward. "I am not going to tell you what to do about your marriage. That is yours to decide, and I will support you no matter what you choose. But I am going to tell you what we are going to do about the Sterlings, because I have known Grant Sterling for 15 years, and I know exactly what kind of man he is, and I have a very strong suspicion about why his son's engagement party needed to be quite so extravagant." I looked up at him. "What do you mean?" My father's expression settled into something I recognized immediately, the particular focused stillness he gets when a business problem has clarified itself in his mind. "Grant Sterling's development company has 3 towers under construction right now," he said. "One of them, the waterfront project on Prescott Street, has been quietly bleeding money for over a year. I know this because 2 of his lenders are people I've done business with for decades, and both of them mentioned, separately, over the last 6 months, that Sterling has been unusually aggressive about seeking new capital. A man whose business is thriving does not throw a 200-guest engagement party at the Aurelia and rent an 8-piece orchestra. A man whose business is drowning does exactly that, because appearances are the only currency he has left to trade on." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest, something that was not quite excitement, but was, perhaps, its colder, more disciplined cousin. "You think he's in trouble?" "I think," my father said, "that we should find out exactly how much trouble, and exactly what he's been telling his investors, before we decide what to do about tonight." I stayed at my father's apartment that night. I did not text Daniel. I did not check my phone at all until the following morning, when I woke in the guest room I have slept in more times over the years than I care to admit, and found 43 missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic text messages, most of them from Daniel, several from Peyton, one, strangely, from Grant Sterling himself, a man who had never once in 4 years texted me directly. Daniel's messages moved through a predictable arc: confusion, then apology, then something closer to desperation. "Elena, please call me back." I had no idea. I swear to God I had no idea. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Peyton feels terrible. She wants to apologize." "Please, we need to talk about this. This is affecting everything." I read each message with a kind of distant, clinical detachment, the way I might review a difficult client complaint at work, cataloging the shape of the apology without yet deciding whether it deserved a response. Peyton's texts were shorter and considerably less contrite. "I didn't know you were rich. That changes literally nothing about how I feel." Followed, 20 minutes later, by a second message: "Actually, please don't tell Tyler's parents anything else. This is already embarrassing enough." There was no apology in either message. There was only, unmistakably, damage control. Grant Sterling's message, sent at 6:47 that morning, was the one that interested me most. "Ms. Cross, I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding, and I would very much like the opportunity to discuss it with you directly at your convenience. I have great respect for Cross Hospitality Group and would hate for last night's unfortunate incident to affect what I hope can be a productive relationship between our families moving forward. I showed the message to my father over coffee. He read it twice, then set my phone down on the table between us with the particular deliberate care of a man handling evidence. That, he said, is not the message of a man who is worried about his son's future mother-in-law being hurt. That is the message of a man who just found out his son's fiancée insulted a business partner he doesn't yet realize he desperately needs. You think he's going to try to use my relationship with Peyton to protect his business, I said. I think, my father said, we should let him try and see exactly how far he's willing to go, because that will tell us everything about who Grant Sterling really is underneath all that charm. Over the following 3 days, while I stayed at my father's apartment and let Daniel's calls go largely unanswered, my team at Cross Hospitality Group, at my direction, quietly began pulling together a comprehensive picture of Sterling Development's financial position. This was not, I want to be clear, an abuse of my company's resources for personal vendetta. Cross Hospitality regularly conducts due diligence on major clients and partners, particularly developers who lease space in our properties or partner with us on large-scale events, and Grant Sterling's firm had, in fact, approached us 8 months earlier about a potential partnership involving a boutique hotel component in his Prescott Street waterfront tower. That partnership discussion had stalled quietly months ago, for reasons that had never been fully explained to me at the time, because I had not been personally involved in the negotiations. I asked my finance team to pull the file. What they found over those 3 days was worse than even my father had anticipated. Sterling Development's Prescott Street project was not merely bleeding money. It was, according to the construction loan documents my team was able to review through standard due diligence channels, roughly $62 million over budget, largely due to a foundation remediation issue that Grant Sterling had apparently known about for the better part of a year and had chosen not to disclose to several of his investors, a decision that, depending on the specific language of those investment agreements, edged uncomfortably close to securities fraud. More troubling still, my team uncovered evidence that Sterling had been using capital raised for a separate, unrelated development, a mid-rise residential project in the Arts District, to cover shortfalls on the Prescott Street project, a practice known as commingling that is, in most jurisdictions, flatly illegal when it involves investor funds raised under specific, restricted use agreements. I sat in my father's home office on the third evening after the engagement party, reviewing the financial summary my forensic accounting team had prepared, and felt something settle into place inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. Grant Sterling had not thrown a 200-guest engagement party because his family was thriving. He had thrown it because he desperately needed to project an image of unshakable wealth and stability to a room full of potential investors, business partners, and social connections, at the exact moment his empire was quietly collapsing beneath him. And his son's fiancée had chosen, on that exact night, to attack the one guest in the room who happened to own the venue, and who happened, as it turned out, to have the resources and the motivation to look very, very closely at exactly what Grant Sterling had been hiding. "What do you want to do?" my father asked me that evening, watching me across his desk with the particular patient attentiveness he has always reserved for moments when he could tell I was working through something important. "I don't want to destroy Tyler," I said slowly. "He didn't do anything to me. And I don't particularly want to destroy Peyton either, if I'm honest, even after everything. She's 24. She's spent her whole life being told a story about me that isn't true, by a mother who had every incentive to make sure she believed it. That's not entirely her fault." "But," my father prompted, "but I am not going to let Grant Sterling use his son's engagement to my stepdaughter as a smokescreen for defrauding his investors," I said. "And I am not going to let my own husband's silence, or my stepdaughter's cruelty, cost me my dignity without consequence. There's a difference between mercy and being a doormat, and I think I've spent 4 years confusing the two." My father smiled, the small, proud smile I have seen perhaps a dozen times in my life, always at moments when he recognized in me the particular decisiveness he had spent decades cultivating in himself. "Then let's talk about exactly how we do this properly," he said. "Because there is a right way to expose a fraud, and there is a way that makes you look vindictive and gives him room to claim victimhood. We're going to do this the right way. Over the following week, while Daniel's messages grew increasingly desperate, and while I finally agreed to a brief, tense phone call in which I informed him that I needed time and space and was not yet prepared to discuss our marriage, my team and I built what my father, with characteristic understatement, referred to as a very complete picture. We traced the flow of misappropriated investor capital between Sterling Development's various projects. We identified 4 separate investors, 3 of them retirees who had put significant portions of their retirement savings into the Prescott Street project specifically because Grant Sterling had personally assured them, in writing, that their funds would be held in a project-specific escrow account, funds that had, in fact, been quietly redirected to cover overruns on an entirely different project months before those investors had signed their agreements. We confirmed, through public county records and a series of entirely legal inquiries, that Sterling Development's primary construction loan on Prescott Street carried a balloon payment due in just under 3 weeks, a payment the company did not, according to our analysis, currently have the liquidity to make. I also learned during that week something that complicated the picture considerably. Priya Anand called me on the 4th day, her voice careful, to let me know that Grant Sterling's office had reached out to the Aurelia directly, requesting a meeting to discuss what his assistant had described as a significant business opportunity, a meeting Priya had, per our standard protocol for high-value prospective clients, tentatively scheduled and then immediately flagged for my personal review. I understood, reading the meeting request, exactly what Grant Sterling was attempting to do. Having discovered, on the night of the engagement party, that his son's future stepmother-in-law was the CEO of one of the region's most prestigious hospitality companies, he was now attempting to leverage that unexpected family connection into a business relationship, likely hoping to secure either a capital infusion, a favorable venue partnership for future Sterling Development projects, or, most likely, both, all while smoothing over the unpleasantness of the engagement party as though it had been a minor social misstep rather than a public humiliation orchestrated by his own future daughter-in-law. I decided to take the meeting. I want to explain why, because I understand that a simpler, more satisfying version of this story would have me refusing all contact with the Sterlings and simply reporting Grant's financial misconduct directly to regulators from a safe, righteous distance. But my father taught me, over decades of building cross-hospitality group, that the most effective way to dismantle a man who has spent his entire life relying on charm and misdirection is to let him walk, confidently, directly into a room where the truth is waiting for him, rather than striking from outside where he can spin the narrative into one of persecution. I wanted Grant Sterling to sit across from me, believing he was about to secure a lifeline, and I wanted him to understand, in real time, exactly how completely he had misjudged the woman his son's fiancée had called the help. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning, in a conference room at Cross Hospitality Group's downtown headquarters, a building Grant Sterling had, I later learned, walked past 100 times without ever once connecting it to the woman he had met at his son's engagement party. I dressed that morning, not in the understated, unremarkable clothing I had worn to family events for 4 years, but in a tailored charcoal suit that I reserve for board meetings and major negotiations, the kind of clothing that communicates, without a single word, exactly who is in control of a room. I had my executive assistant confirm that my father would be present, seated quietly at the far end of the table, not speaking unless necessary, simply present as a reminder, should Grant Sterling need one, that I did not build this company alone, and that the resources arrayed against him extended well beyond a single conference room. Grant Sterling arrived precisely on time, dressed in an expensive gray suit, carrying a leather portfolio, wearing the particular confident smile of a man who believes he is about to charm his way into a solution. He was accompanied by a lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Preston Vance, who I would learn, over the following hour, had been Sterling Development's general counsel for nearly a decade and who had, according to the financial records my team had compiled, personally drafted several of the investor agreements at the center of the fraud we had uncovered. "Ms. Cross," Grant said, extending his hand as he entered the conference room, his smile broad and practiced. "Thank you so much for making time for this. I have to say, I was truly mortified by what happened at Peyton's engagement party. Truly. I had a long conversation with my son about it, and I want you to know that our family does not condone that kind of behavior toward guests, particularly not toward someone who, as it turns out, has built something as impressive as what you've built here." I let the apology sit in the air for a moment before responding. watching him carefully, noting the way his eyes moved briefly around the conference room, taking in the framed awards on the walls, the view of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, doing the silent mathematics that men like Grant Sterling are always doing, calculating exactly how much leverage a person's visible success affords them. "I appreciate that, Grant," I said, gesturing for him and Preston Vance to sit. "Though I have to say, I was surprised to receive your meeting request so quickly. I would have expected the more pressing conversation to be between Peyton and me directly, rather than between our respective businesses." "Well," Grant said, settling into his chair with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to controlling the room, "I think family matters and business matters can exist somewhat separately, don't you? I certainly don't want what happened between the kids to overshadow what I think could be a very productive relationship between Cross Hospitality and Sterling Development. In fact, that's actually part of why I wanted to meet with you directly. I have a project, the Prescott Street Waterfront Tower, that I think could benefit enormously from a boutique hospitality partner of your caliber for the ground floor commercial and events space. I know we had some preliminary conversations with your team months ago that didn't move forward, but I'd love the opportunity to revisit that, particularly now that I understand we're practically family." I nodded slowly, allowing a small, considering pause to stretch across the table. "Tell me about Prescott Street," I said. "How is the project progressing?" Grant's smile did not falter, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of recalibration, the reflexive caution of a man accustomed to controlling the flow of information about his own company's health. "It's progressing very well," he said smoothly. "We're on track for a completion date next fall. We've had tremendous investor interest, tremendous confidence in the project. It's really going to be a transformative addition to the waterfront." "That's interesting," I said, "because my understanding is that the project is currently $62 million over its original budget, primarily due to a foundation remediation issue that your engineering team identified nearly a year ago, and that you have not yet disclosed to at least 4 of your investors, 3 of whom placed retirement funds into the project specifically because you personally assured them, in writing, that those funds would be held in a project-specific escrow account rather than commingled with capital raised for your arts district development." The room went very quiet. Preston Vance's pen, which had been moving idly across his legal pad, stopped completely. Grant Sterling's smile finally, fully collapsed, replaced by an expression of controlled alarm that he was clearly working very hard to keep from becoming visible panic. "I don't know where you're getting your information," Grant said, his voice noticeably tighter than it had been 30 seconds earlier, "but I can assure you that whatever you've heard is a significant mischaracterization of a perfectly standard capital management strategy. Every developer moves funds between projects as needed. That's simply how the industry works. It's how the industry works when the funds aren't legally restricted to a specific project by the terms of the investment agreement," I said calmly. "Which, according to the copies of your investor agreements that my legal team has reviewed, is exactly what happened here." "I have those documents, Grant. I have the loan documents for Prescott Street, including the balloon payment due in 17 days that your company does not currently have the liquidity to make. And I have a very clear timeline showing when you knew about the foundation issue, and when, if ever, you disclosed it to the affected investors." Preston Vance leaned forward. "Ms. Cross, I would advise significant caution here. Whatever documents you believe you've obtained, if they were acquired improperly, could expose you to considerable liability." "They were acquired entirely properly," I said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Cross Hospitality Group conducts standard due diligence on all major prospective business partners, which is precisely what your firm's proposal to us 8 months ago authorized us to do per the mutual disclosure agreement your office signed at the time. Everything my team reviewed was either publicly available through county and court records or was voluntarily provided by your own company as part of that original due diligence process. I would be very careful, Mr. Vance, about suggesting impropriety on my end when the documents in question describe, in fairly unambiguous terms, your client's own conduct." Grant Sterling's face had gone pale, the practiced charm entirely stripped away now, replaced by something raw, more desperate. "Elena," he said, dropping the formality entirely, "let's be reasonable here. Whatever happened at the engagement party, whatever my son's fiancé said, that has nothing to do with this. You and I could actually help each other. If word gets out about the Prescott Street situation before I can secure the balloon payment, the entire project collapses, and a lot of good people, contractors, subcontractors, ordinary working people, are going to lose their jobs and their money. Surely that's not something you want to be responsible for. I'm not responsible for the choices you made, I said quietly. You are? You knew about the foundation issue for nearly a year. You continued soliciting investment from retirees under false pretenses during that entire time. You commingled restricted funds in a way that likely violates the specific terms of at least 3 separate investment agreements, and quite possibly securities law more broadly. None of that happened because of me. It happened because you gambled that your reputation and your charm would hold the whole structure together long enough for you to find a way out, and now you're sitting in my conference room, in a building you had no idea I owned 3 weeks ago, hoping that the fact that our families are about to be connected by marriage will convince me to look the other way. Grant was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence entirely. What do you want? He said. I want you to understand something clearly, I said. I did not come into this meeting planning to destroy you. I came into this meeting because your general counsel drafted investor agreements promising restricted use of funds that you then violated, and because I believe the people who trusted you with their retirement savings deserve to know the truth before your balloon payment comes due and the entire project collapses around them with no warning at all. What happens next depends entirely on what you do in the next 17 days. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a document my legal team had prepared over the previous 3 days, outlining a path that, while it would not erase the fraud that had already occurred, would at minimum prevent it from becoming catastrophically worse. This is a proposed disclosure and remediation framework, I said. It requires you to immediately and voluntarily disclose the true financial condition of Prescott Street to all affected investors, to work with a court-appointed monitor to ensure any recovered or restructured funds are properly allocated, and to personally guarantee restitution to the 4 investors whose funds were improperly commingled, using your personal assets if the company's assets prove insufficient. If you do this, voluntarily, within the next 5 business days, I will not personally refer the matter to the state securities regulator or the district attorney's office, though I want to be extremely clear that this does not guarantee those investors won't pursue their own legal remedies, nor does it prevent regulators from independently discovering what has occurred, which, given the scale of this, I consider likely regardless of what you decide today. And if I refuse, Grant said quietly, then I will refer everything my team has compiled to the appropriate regulatory authorities within 24 hours, I said, and I suspect the balloon payment on Prescott Street will become the least of your problems. Grant Sterling sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the document in front of him, and I watched, with something that was not quite satisfaction but was close to it, the particular collapse of a man who has spent his entire life believing that charm and confidence could outrun consequence indefinitely, finally understanding that the bill had come due. I need to discuss this with my attorney, he said finally, his voice hollow. You have 5 business days, I said. I'd encourage you to use them wisely. Before Grant left that final meeting, there was one more exchange that I have thought about often in the months since. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back toward me with an expression I had not yet seen from him, something closer to genuine curiosity than calculation. Can I ask you something, Elena? Off the record, so to speak. You can ask, I said. Why didn't you just destroy me from the start? You had every piece of leverage you needed the moment your team pulled those loan documents. You could have gone straight to the district attorney, straight to the papers, and let the whole thing burn without ever giving me a chance to fix any of it. Most people in your position would have. God knows I would have, if the positions were reversed. I considered the question for a moment before answering, because I wanted to give him a true answer rather than a comfortable one. Because somewhere in that ballroom, under the wine and the humiliation, I still remembered what it felt like to be underestimated by people who never bothered to actually look at me, I said. You underestimated me too, Grant. The same way Peyton did. The same way Renata did. You thought a quiet woman in an ivory dress was someone you could charm your way past. But the difference between what Peyton did to me and what I chose to do to you is that I had the power to simply crush you the moment I understood what you'd done, and I decided that having power and using it without restraint are not actually the same thing. I wanted you to have a chance to be better than the choices you'd already made. What you did with that chance was always going to be up to you. Grant nodded slowly, something that looked almost like respect moving across his tired face. For what it's worth, he said, I think Peyton is going to spend a long time regretting that toast. Longer than she probably realizes right now. I did not respond to that, because I did not yet know whether it was true, and because I understood, even then, that whatever regret Peyton eventually came to feel would need to be hers alone, arrived at honestly, rather than something I could hurry along through the collapse of her fiancé's family fortune. There was one additional conversation from that period that I have not yet mentioned. One that mattered to me perhaps more than any of the boardroom confrontations, because it had nothing to do with leverage or consequence and everything to do with the particular, complicated grief of watching a family unravel. Camille Sterling called my office 3 weeks after that final meeting with Grant, and I very nearly did not take the call, assuming reasonably that she intended to plead her husband's case or accuse me of orchestrating their downfall out of spite. Instead, when I picked up the phone, Camille's voice was quiet, stripped of the performative polish I remembered from the engagement party, the diamond color and the practiced smile entirely absent from the woman speaking to me now. "I'm not calling to ask you for anything," she said before I could speak. "I just wanted to say something, and then I'll let you go. I was there that night. I watched what Peyton did to you, and I watched my husband and my son's future in-laws laugh along with it, and I said nothing, because saying something would have meant acknowledging, in front of 200 people, that my own family celebration had turned cruel in a way that reflected poorly on all of us. I have spent 22 years married to a man who taught me that appearances mattered more than almost anything else, and I am ashamed, now, of how easily I absorbed that lesson. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I've had a very comfortable life built on choices I am only now starting to fully understand the cost of. I just wanted you to know that I saw what happened to you that night, clearly, and I should have said something, and I didn't, and I think that failure has been sitting with me every single day since. I did not know in that moment what to say to her, because her honesty was so unexpected, so unlike anything I had encountered from the Sterling family up to that point, that it genuinely disarmed me. "Thank you for telling me that," I said finally. "I think it takes a particular kind of courage to say that out loud, especially now, when there's nothing left for you to gain from saying it." "Maybe," Camille said. "Or maybe I'm just finally tired of staying quiet to protect a version of my life that was never actually as solid as it looked." She paused. "I hope Peyton figures that out too, eventually, before she spends 22 years learning it the way I did." That conversation stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that period, longer, in some ways, than the satisfaction of watching Grant Sterling's empire formally collapse in bankruptcy court. It reminded me that the people who participate in our humiliation are rarely simple villains, and are far more often ordinary people who have made a long, quiet series of small compromises with their own conscience, compromises that eventually accumulate into something they no longer fully recognize as a choice at all, until a night like that engagement party forces them, whether they want it or not, to finally see the shape of what they've built. Grant Sterling and Preston Vance left my office 20 minutes later, considerably smaller than they had entered it. My father, who had sat silently at the far end of the table for the entire meeting, waited until the door closed behind them before he finally spoke. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. "I would have simply destroyed him. You gave him a way to do the right thing. That's a harder thing to do, and a better one." "I'm not sure he'll take it," I said. "He might not." My father agreed. "But that will be his choice, not yours. And either way, Elena, you just showed him and yourself exactly what happens to people who mistake your quietness for weakness." Over the following days, while Grant Sterling's team worked frantically behind the scenes, I finally agreed to sit down with Daniel, not at the house we shared, but at a neutral coffee shop near my father's building, a location I chose deliberately, wanting the conversation to happen somewhere that belonged to neither of us, somewhere I could leave, easily and without complication, the moment I felt the conversation had run its course. Daniel looked, when I arrived, genuinely exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, his usual careful composure entirely worn away. "Elena," he said, standing as I sat down across from him. "I don't even know where to start. I am so sorry. I should have said something that night. I should have stopped Peyton the second she started talking." I froze. I've spent every day since trying to figure out why I froze, and the only honest answer I have is that I've spent so many years trying to keep the peace with Peyton, trying not to lose her the way I felt like I'd already lost so much of her childhood, that I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that keeping peace with her couldn't come at the cost of protecting you. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. But it's the truth, and I owe you the truth. I listened to him without interrupting, watching his face, trying to gauge whether what I was hearing was genuine reckoning or simply a more sophisticated form of the same conflict avoidance that had defined our entire marriage. Daniel, I said finally, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about that one night. That night was simply the moment where 4 years of small silences finally became one large, unmistakable one. I have spent our entire marriage watching you choose not to see what was happening in front of you, because seeing it clearly would have required you to actually do something about it, and doing something about it might have cost you Peyton's approval. I understand why that fear exists. I understand the guilt you carry about her childhood, but I am not willing to spend the rest of my life being the person who absorbs the cost of that guilt. I know, Daniel said quietly. I know that's what happened. I've had a lot of time to sit with it over the last week. He paused, and something in his expression shifted, became more careful, more deliberate. I also need to tell you something, because I think you deserve to know it before you decide anything else. Peyton told me 2 days ago, something Renata said to her the night before the engagement party. Renata told her, apparently fairly explicitly, that the party was Peyton's chance to, and I'm quoting what Peyton told me, finally put that woman in her place in front of everyone who matters. I don't think Peyton came up with that toast entirely on her own. I think her mother built the foundation for it over years, and Peyton delivered the speech her mother had essentially been writing since she was 6 years old. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through me, a reluctant, unwanted flicker of understanding for the girl who had thrown wine in my face, even as I remained entirely unwilling to excuse her for it. That doesn't undo what she did, I said. She's 24, Daniel. Old enough to choose not to be a weapon in her mother's war, even if her mother handed her the ammunition. I know, Daniel said. I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm not even sure I've fully forgiven her myself yet, and she's my daughter. I just wanted you to have the full picture, because I think it matters, at least a little, for understanding how we got here. I did not resolve my marriage in that conversation, and I want to be honest about that. Because this is not, ultimately, a story about a marriage neatly repaired in a single tearful coffee shop conversation. I told Daniel that I needed considerably more time, that I was not prepared to simply return home as though nothing had happened, and that whatever came next between us would depend entirely on whether his actions, over the following weeks and months, matched the accountability he was finally, belatedly offering me in words. He accepted this with a kind of quiet, exhausted grace that felt, for the first time in years, like something genuine rather than performative peacekeeping. The 5 business days I had given Grant Sterling passed slowly. On the 4th day, Priya called to inform me that Sterling Development had formally requested a follow-up meeting and that Grant had, according to his assistant, spent the previous 3 days in near-constant meetings with his legal and financial teams. I took the meeting on the morning of the 5th day, and this time, Grant Sterling arrived alone, without Preston Vance, carrying a considerably thinner leather portfolio than he had the week before. I've decided to accept your framework, he said, before he had even fully sat down. I've already begun the process of disclosing the true financial condition of Prescott Street to all affected investors. My attorneys have advised me that this will very likely trigger significant legal exposure regardless of what I do now, but they also agree that voluntary disclosure will be considerably better received by regulators than a referral initiated by an outside party. He paused, and something in his composure finally, fully cracked, the last remnants of his practiced charm giving way to something that looked almost like genuine grief. I'm going to lose the company, Elena. Probably the house too, once the restitution obligations are finalized. I built Sterling Development over 25 years, and it's going to end because I made a series of decisions I told myself, at the time, were temporary, manageable, the kind of thing every developer does when cash flow gets tight. I don't expect you to feel sorry for me. I just wanted you to understand that you were right about all of it, and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise anymore. I looked at him for a long moment, feeling unexpectedly, not triumph but something closer to a kind of tired, complicated sorrow, the particular ache of watching a man's carefully constructed empire collapse under the weight of choices that had felt, to him, reasonable in each individual moment, even as they accumulated into something catastrophic. I'm not going to pretend I feel sorry for you either, Grant, I said. But I will say this. The fact that you chose to disclose voluntarily, even after everything, even knowing what it will cost you, matters. It won't undo the harm you caused those investors, but it's the difference between a man who got caught and a man who, eventually, chose to do the right thing, even too late. That distinction won't mean much to a regulator, but it means something to me. Grant nodded slowly, and then, quietly, almost as an afterthought, he said, I spoke to Tyler about everything. About the business, about the party, about what Peyton said to you. I don't know what will happen with the engagement, honestly. He's furious with both his mother and me, and I think, frankly, he's furious with Peyton too, though that's between them. I just wanted you to know that whatever else happens, I made sure my son understood exactly how badly his fiancée behaved that night, and exactly how much grace you extended to our family in return, given everything you could have done instead. I did not respond to that directly, because I did not yet know what I felt about Tyler or about the future of Peyton's engagement, and I understood that it was not, in the end, my responsibility to manage. I simply nodded, shook Grant Sterling's hand, and let him leave my office for the final time, understanding that whatever remained of Sterling development would be, from that point forward, a matter for regulators, courts, and Grant's own conscience to sort out. Before any of that unfolded, however, there was a period of nearly 2 weeks where I found myself, almost against my will, thinking constantly about the 4 investors whose names had appeared in the financial documents my forensic team had compiled. I asked my father one evening whether it was strange that I felt more concern for people I had never met than I did for the family I had spent 4 years trying to belong to. It's not strange at all, my father said. It tells you something important about yourself. You were never actually chasing Peyton's approval, or Renata's, or even Daniel's family's acceptance in some abstract sense. You were chasing the feeling of being treated fairly. And fairness is exactly what those investors were denied. Of course, that's where your attention goes. I asked my legal team to identify the 4 investors by name, not so that I could use their circumstances as leverage against Grant Sterling, but because I wanted, quietly and without fanfare, to understand who they were. 2 of them, a retired schoolteacher named Doris Hollenbeck and her husband, had invested nearly $400,000 of their retirement savings into Prescott Street after attending a presentation Grant Sterling had personally given at their country club 18 months earlier, a presentation in which he had specifically described the escrow protections built into the investment structure. A third was a widowed contractor named Marcus Alvarez, who had put his late wife's life insurance payout into the project because Grant Sterling had personally assured him, over a round of golf, that Prescott Street was as close to guaranteed as real estate gets in this city. The fourth was a younger woman, a nurse named Priscilla Owusu, who had invested a modest but significant sum, nearly $60,000, money she had been saving for a down payment on her first home. When Doris Hollenbeck learned, through the formal disclosure process Grant Sterling had agreed to, that her retirement savings had been sitting for months in an account that had already been substantially drained to cover cost overruns on an entirely different project, she called Cross Hospitality's general offices, having somehow traced the disclosure letter back to the due diligence process that had triggered it. I took the call myself, something my assistant later told me she had never seen me do for an unscheduled call from someone outside the company. Doris was not angry with me. She was, if anything, bewildered and grateful, unable to fully understand why a stranger had uncovered what her own investment advisor had missed, or chosen not to see. I don't understand why you cared enough to look, she said, her voice trembling slightly over the phone. You didn't know us. You didn't owe us anything. I think, I told her, sometimes the people who are used to being overlooked are the ones who notice it happening to someone else the fastest. I want to be honest that this part of the story did not resolve as cleanly as a courtroom drama might suggest. Restitution, once the bankruptcy proceedings began, moved slowly, complicated by competing creditor claims, by the fact that Sterling Development's remaining assets were worth considerably less than the total owed to its investors, and by months of legal wrangling that I largely observed from a distance, through periodic updates from my legal team. Doris and her husband ultimately recovered roughly 70% of their original investment, a partial victory that still meant a materially diminished retirement. Marcus Alvarez recovered less, closer to 50%, a fact that still, when I think about it, leaves me with a quiet, persistent anger at Grant Sterling that 6 months of distance has not entirely softened. Priscilla Owusu, whose investment had been comparatively smaller, was made essentially whole in part because Cross Hospitality Group, at my direction and with my father's full support, quietly made up the remaining difference from a discretionary fund we maintain for exactly this kind of situation, a fact I never disclosed to Priscilla directly. And one I am only mentioning now because I think it matters to understand that consequence, when pursued honestly, is never really about punishment. For its own sake. It is about repair, wherever repair remains possible, and about accountability wherever it does not. The social fallout, meanwhile, moved with considerably more speed than the legal proceedings. Renata, who had spent years cultivating a particular reputation among a specific circle of country club acquaintances as a woman of impeccable taste and unimpeachable judgment, found her own credibility unexpectedly entangled in the collapse, largely because she had been, by her own admission during a conversation Daniel later relayed to me, deeply involved in planning the engagement party's guest list. A list that had included several of Grant Sterling's prospective investors specifically, because Renata had wanted to impress them on Peyton's behalf. When word spread through that same social circle about the fraud, about the humiliating scene with the wine, and about the increasingly public unraveling of Sterling development, Renata discovered that her carefully built social standing was considerably more fragile than she had assumed. Several of the women she had once held court among quietly stopped including her in their smaller gatherings, not out of any particular loyalty to me, but out of the same instinctive social self-preservation that had once, ironically, worked in her favor. I felt, when Daniel told me this, no particular satisfaction. I felt, if anything, a kind of tired recognition of how thoroughly these systems of status and belonging reward performance over substance, right up until the moment the performance collapses under its own weight, at which point they turn on their former favorites with exactly the same cold efficiency they once offered as protection. The following weeks unfolded with a kind of quiet, cascading consequence that I did not orchestrate directly, but that flowed, inevitably, from the choices various people had made. Sterling Development's voluntary disclosure triggered exactly the response Grant's attorneys had predicted: a state securities investigation, a wave of investor lawsuits, and, within 6 weeks, a bankruptcy filing that stripped Grant Sterling of his development company, his primary residence, and, according to details that filtered back to me through Daniel, a significant portion of Camille Sterling's jewelry collection, liquidated to help fund the restitution obligations. Renata's satisfaction at the engagement party, I later learned, curdled considerably once it became clear that her daughter's fiancé's family was not, in fact, the real family of stability and old money she had spent years positioning them as, but rather a family whose wealth had been, for the better part of a year, a carefully maintained illusion propped up by fraud. Peyton's engagement to Tyler did not survive the fallout, though not, as it turned out, primarily because of the financial collapse. Daniel told me, several weeks later, that Tyler had ended things after learning the full details of what had happened at the party, telling Peyton, according to what he later told his father, that he could not build a marriage with someone who was capable of that kind of casual cruelty toward another person, particularly someone who had genuinely done nothing to earn it beyond the misfortune of marrying into a complicated family. I felt no particular satisfaction in this development. I had not orchestrated it, had not wished specifically for it, and understood that whatever pain it caused Peyton was hers to sit with, separate from anything I had done. I did eventually speak with Peyton directly, roughly 2 months after the engagement party, at Daniel's careful, tentative request. She came to a small restaurant near my father's apartment, considerably diminished from the confident young woman who had stood on that platform with a champagne flute in her hand, and she apologized, haltingly, in a way that felt, for the first time in 4 years, genuinely uncertain rather than performative. "I don't even fully understand why I did it," she admitted, staring at her hands folded on the table between us. "I think I'd spent so many years being told a story about you, about what you represented, that I never actually stopped to ask myself whether the story was true. I just needed you to be the villain, because if you weren't the villain, then I had to sit with the fact that my parents' divorce wasn't actually your fault, and that my mom had spent years making sure I never had to sit with that. I did not offer her easy forgiveness, because I did not yet feel it, but I did tell her, honestly, that I understood, at least in part, how a person could spend years constructing a narrative that protected them from a harder, more complicated truth. I'm not going to pretend that night didn't happen, Peyton," I said. And I'm not going to pretend we're suddenly close, or that I trust you the way I might trust someone who hadn't spent 4 years treating me the way you did. But I am willing to let you show me slowly over time whether you're actually interested in a different relationship, or whether this apology is simply about damage control now that the consequences have finally caught up with your family. That's fair, Peyton said quietly. That's more than fair. 6 months after the engagement party, I stood in the newly opened event wing of the Aurelia, a space I had spent much of the preceding months personally overseeing the renovation of, transforming a previously underused section of the building into a dedicated community venue that Cross Hospitality Group now offers, free of charge 12 times a year, to nonprofit organizations serving survivors of family estrangement and domestic conflict, an initiative I named, with my father's quiet blessing, the Cross Family Fund. I had made a decision in the aftermath of that night that the same building where I had once been publicly humiliated for hiding my identity should become, instead, a space where people rebuilding their own sense of dignity and belonging could gather without cost, without judgment, and without the particular exhausting performance of proving their worth to rooms that had already decided not to see them. Daniel and I are still married, though the shape of that marriage has changed considerably over the intervening months. Built now on a foundation of far more direct, far less comfortable honesty than either of us had previously been willing to practice. He has, to his credit, spent real, consistent effort over these months demonstrating exactly the kind of accountability he promised me in that coffee shop, including a difficult, ongoing process of family therapy with Peyton that has, slowly, begun to reshape the dynamic between the three of us into something that no longer requires my silence as its price of admission. I will not pretend that this process has been simple or linear. There were entire weeks, particularly in the first 2 months after the engagement party, when Daniel and I lived in the same house but spoke to each other with the careful, exhausted formality of two people negotiating a treaty rather than two people who had once fallen in love over quiet dinners and long, unhurried conversations. There were nights I slept at my father's apartment simply because I needed distance from a house that still, at the time, felt saturated with the memory of Daniel's silence. There was one particularly difficult evening, roughly 6 weeks into that period, when Daniel finally asked me the question I think he had been circling for weeks without quite finding the courage to voice directly, whether I had ever considered seriously ending the marriage entirely. I told him the truth, which was that I had. I told him that I had spent several nights lying awake in my father's guest room, turning the question over with the same clinical rigor I might apply to a difficult business decision, weighing what I owed to 4 years of genuine love against what I owed to my own dignity. What ultimately kept me in the marriage, I told him, was not sentimentality, and it was not simply inertia. It was the fact that Daniel, unlike Peyton, unlike Renata, unlike Grant Sterling, never once tried to minimize what had happened, never once suggested I was overreacting, never once asked me to simply move past it for the sake of keeping the family comfortable. He had, instead, done the considerably harder work of sitting with his own failure without flinching away from it, and had continued doing that work, consistently, over weeks and then months, long after the initial shock and shame of that night had faded into something he could easily have chosen to quietly minimize instead. I'm not staying because I've decided to forget what happened, I told him that night. I'm staying because you've shown me repeatedly that you're capable of actually changing rather than simply apologizing and hoping the apology does the work the change should be doing. Those are very different things, Daniel, and I need you to understand that I will be watching for a long time to make sure the second one is really what's happening here. I understand, he said. And I think, honestly, I needed you to leave for those weeks, needed the distance, to fully understand exactly how much of my life had been organized around avoiding exactly this kind of reckoning. I spent so many years telling myself I was protecting Peyton from more loss by refusing to ever fully hold her accountable for anything, and what I actually did was teach her that cruelty toward the people I loved would always be tolerated, as long as it came from her. That's not protection. I understand now that it was its own kind of abandonment, just aimed in a different direction. Our marriage today looks different than it did before that night, not smaller, but more honest. Built on a foundation that required both of us to survive something neither of us particularly wanted to go through in order to arrive at it. I do not offer this as a tidy resolution, a suggestion that every marriage tested this severely deserves to be salvaged, or that staying is always the right choice. I offer it simply as the true account of my own particular circumstances, understanding that another person in my exact position might reasonably have made a different decision, and that such a decision would have been no less valid than mine. I stood beneath the glass dome of the Aurelia that evening, 6 months after a glass of wine had been thrown in my face in that exact spot, watching a small non-profit gala unfold, watching guests who had spent years being told they did not belong in rooms like this one move confidently through a space I had built specifically to prove otherwise, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, entirely unapologetically myself. Not the quiet interior consultant who existed to keep other people comfortable. Not the wife who absorbed silence as the price of belonging. Simply Elena Cross, standing in a building she owned, having finally, fully stopped shrinking to fit inside a space that was never built to hold the entirety of who she actually was. The story of that engagement party, of the wine and the toast and the 4 words that changed everything in that ballroom, carries a lesson I think about often now, one that extends far beyond the specific circumstances of my own marriage and family. So many of us spend years quietly diminishing ourselves in the hope that smallness will earn us safety, that hiding our full strength will somehow protect us from resentment or rejection. What I learned, standing in that ballroom with wine dripping down my chin, is that this strategy rarely works the way we hope. People who are inclined to disrespect us will often do so regardless of how small we make ourselves, and the only thing our hiding truly accomplishes is delaying the moment when we finally, fully stand in our own truth. Peyton did not throw that wine because she knew who I really was. She threw it because she had spent years believing I was someone small enough to attack without consequence, and my own silence, however well-intentioned, had helped build that belief. I do not regret, entirely, the years I spent hoping to be loved without the complication of my success attached to the equation. That hope came from a real and understandable place, a desire that I think many people, particularly women who have built something significant on their own, will recognize in themselves. But I have learned in the months since that night that authentic love does not require our diminishment as its foundation, and that any relationship, romantic or familial, that depends on us making ourselves smaller in order to be tolerated is not, in the end, a relationship built on love at all. It is a relationship built on management, on the careful, exhausting maintenance of other people's comfort at the direct cost of our own dignity. If there is one thing I would want anyone watching this to carry away from my story, it is this: you do not owe anyone a smaller version of yourself in exchange for their acceptance. The people who are worthy of your presence in their lives will not require you to hide the full truth of who you are in order to earn their respect, and the people who do require that hiding were never, truly, offering you belonging in the first place. They were simply offering you conditional tolerance, dressed up to look like family. Stand fully in your own truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it disrupts a room full of people who have grown comfortable underestimating you, because the moment you finally do, you may find, as I did, that the truth was never something to hide at all. It was simply waiting patiently for you to finally, fully claim it. Thank you for watching and for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, if you have ever had to reclaim a space, a title, or a truth that others tried to take from you, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing, because there are so many more stories like this one still to tell.